Hello everyone and welcome to PRIA's Research Community Webinar, an initiative of PRIA's Education Community Committee. My name is Alyssa Lewis, and as the member of the ECC, I'm excited to be hosting you today for our ResCom session. And I am super excited about today's presenter and also about the topic, which is certainly, I think, a passion to many of you here today. Firstly, a little bit about today's presenter, who is Associate Professor Amisha Mehta. And she is truly a leader in her field, specialising in risk and crisis communication, which she examines through the lens of trust at QUT's Business School. She applies this expertise in funded projects in emerging industries such as hydrogen energy and commercial drones, and also in the context of corporate crises and natural hazard emergencies. She actively works within the industry and does a really fantastic job translating research into practice, which is critical in today's industry. And what this often does is not just segue between industry and academia, but it leads to changes in organisational practice and also in national policy. So having a huge impact with the work that she's doing. Secondly, some background on today's session. So we're today talking, or Amisha will be talking about crises, misinformation and disinformation and how that can harm lives, property and organisational trust. Now, what Amisha will be speaking about today is the first time that the industry will hear about it from her. So this is a good opportunity that we have today to hear it here first. And what today's presentation will cover is the series or the outcome of a series of interviews that Amisha did with leading PR experts around the country. And what this has led to is what Amisha will outline today, which is three things. So how to prepare for crisis misinformation, how to make and communicate decisions about crisis misinformation, and importantly, how to evaluate crisis misinformation. Now, for the first part of today's session, Amisha will take the floor and we'll go through these fascinating findings and research that she has been working on. You are all encouraged to participate by asking questions in the chat throughout. Today's session will be 45 minutes, so we will round out the questions at the end of Amisha's presentation at 12:45, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of today's session as well. So with that, over to you, Amisha.
Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks, Maddie, for organising this. Hi, everyone. I can see some of our QT grads on the list. It's lovely to see you there. If you don't know a lot about QUT, we're based in Brisbane. We're very much, a tagline, the university for the real world. So we're very applied in the work that we do. And my PhD in 2011 was originally on crisis, a slight diversion into risk from a natural hazard perspective. And part of the reason why I started this work in crisis misinformation is that I guess it's the heart of what I like to research. This is a project that I led with Professor Brooke Liu, who's based at the University of Maryland, Ellen Tyquin and Dr. Lisa Tam. So it's a collaborative effort, and perhaps some of you on the line were also the experts who we interviewed. So I guess from following on from what Alyssa was talking about, we have heard a lot about misinformation, fake news, disinformation, and that work is emergent in the academic literature as well. But what was kind of new and a bit cutting edge when we started this project was crisis misinformation, and how misinformation, disinformation could amplify, interrupt the crisis narrative of organisations, and ultimately could affect organisational reputations, and in some cases could affect people's lives and property. So some of the case studies that our participants took us through were ones where false information was shared about a potential dam failure event that was quickly rectified, but nonetheless a challenge. So throughout our paper, we proposed a new definition for crisis misinformation, which you can read here, and it added a little to the literature based on the types of crisis misinformation that our participants identified, but also the formatting and structure of crisis misinformation. What I was really keen to kick off with was hearing from you. Feel free to pop it into the chat, any experiences that you might have had with crisis misinformation. So when you're within a crisis situation and pieces of false content, images or text are emergent. So it'd be interesting to hear from you, and I can perhaps relay some of the findings to that too. So feel free to drop that into the chat as we go through. It's really interesting. My PhD was based on the pharmaceutical industry, and generally speaking in Australia, we don't really have good awareness of pharmaceutical company names, but that's changed of late. We all know AstraZeneca, Pfizer, etc. So, but interestingly, the Australian government and the WHO, especially at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, actually created information strategies to address crisis misinformation associated with what the pandemic was and what it was not. And that has also been quite culturally different based on the experiences, and also differs by socioeconomic status too within countries. So at the moment, you might have seen the Australian government has a website that's also trying to address misinformation associated with vaccinations at present. And part of this is a role of building people's knowledge, so the educational component, but also offsetting perspectives here. Sorry about that. That's probably an online shopping delivery at my house. We'll ignore it though. So keep in mind that when we're addressing misinformation, it can come from and require a strategy to address the content, but also enhance literacy aspects as well. So we began this paper in 2019, and sometimes academia is criticised for lagging behind industry, and sometimes that's definitely warranted. But for those of you, I'm not sure if anyone on the line is an academic, but if you are, you'll be able to empathise with me. But often we will produce research, and you know, sometimes we can do it within a really rapid response time. This process took about 8 months. We were delayed a little with the beginning of COVID-19 and a shift for me to online teaching, but that's pretty quick by paper standards. However, once we submit the manuscript, it's with the journal and the editor and peer reviewers. And in this case, this paper was under review for quite some time because a few reviewers didn't hit their timelines, which is a bit cheeky. But anyway, we started in 2019 really because we were interested in looking at crisis misinformation. It was difficult for us to find a theory that would fit. And theory for me is a really valuable way of understanding processes around problems, but also understanding phases of how people make decisions or commit to an idea. So I draw a lot on theories that are applied, and often theories that go through certain sequences or processes. And you know, hopefully that's some of the things that you take from your university degrees as well. It was difficult, however, in this case to find a theory that naturally fit with what we were interested in studying. And of the work that we knew was emergent in this field, and it was literally at the time one study, most research, that research had taken a very public centered view. So they ran experiments to test how consumers would respond to a misinformation response from an organisation. we wanted to do it a little differently and understand what Australian practitioners thought of crisis misinformation. And we deliberately wanted to do that because there is a lot of the research record is based on US or European research, and we're very lucky to now have Professor Maureen Taylor at UTS, and she's the editor of PR Review. So, you know, we're seeing a lot more Australian-centric research come into play in the international market. So we reviewed what we could from the existing research record, but for us, it was really, let's understand what Australian practitioners might do and examine the difference between misinformation and crisis misinformation from that decision-making lens. So you can read through the 4 kind of research questions that we developed, and a big gap in the literature was around evaluation strategies and approaches. And we really needed that to be able to add to the literature, but more importantly, support opportunities for teaching within universities, but also for practice too. Thanks, Luke, for the example of misinformation. Yeah, the interpretive layer, I think, is really critical and can be quite a burden for a consumer or the end user, but also for the organisation. So the method that we chose for this is a series of interviews. These were in-depth interviews that ranged from 35 minutes to 65 minutes with Australian experts. We selected participants who had experience with crisis misinformation and could unpack those case studies with us. Overall, it was such a privilege to be able to interview our participants. 18 years of experience was the average. They held multiple roles within agencies, government departments, listed companies, and some were CEOs, others were at director level positions. Unsurprisingly, in the Australian market, 61% representation of female, 39% male. We analysed the data using NVivo, which is really just a data reduction mechanism, and then drew out thematic analyses. So the data that I will present now gives you a sense of what we're seeing as the more popular themes and the stronger themes around crisis misinformation. So these are the 4 different types of crisis misinformation that were identified by our participants. And the most frequent response was misinterpretation, which I think touches a little on the point you were making there, Luke, that misinterpretation was where there was blurred understanding of some complex situations. And in some cases, that could be spurred on by journalists interviewing so-called experts on a particular crisis, yet the expert wasn't as well informed as the organisation, and so presented a skewed view of the situation. So, the intent may not have been deliberate in that case, but did lead to setting an agenda around that was not correct rather. So that could also be text-based, but it could or oral, but it was also visual. So where a photograph was taken of an event or some sort of issue within the natural environment, and then that was forwarded on as being truth, or framed in a certain way that wasn't quite correct. So it's interesting that misinterpretation, started to play a role here, which is quite different to what we look at in general misinformation situations. Speculative information also came up, and this was often referred to as when external stakeholders, and generally speaking unions, used the crisis and seized on the crisis to interject their positions and promote their vested interests. And that often sent the crisis off on a different path. There was also situations where false information, so cases of disinformation, were shared by external parties. And in some cases, there were clear motivations behind that. In other cases, the motivations were unknown because the source of that false information was very difficult to verify. One of the case studies actually identified that a particular piece of false information was identified by a telecommunications provider linked to the organisation, because there was this massive spike in text messaging and at an odd time that just didn't sit within normal parameters. And the telecoms representative just dug a little deeper to say, what are people sharing? And while they found the original source of that, they couldn't identify them by personal type to be able to work out why they decided to do it. Interestingly, inconsistent information was identified where two different departments within the same organisation shared conflicting information. In some cases, this might have been correct at the time, but when two sources are sharing that information at the same time and a consumer or community member is receiving that information from the same organisation, that adds an additional challenge on trust. So it's trust in the information, but also trust in the organisation behind it. What was really interesting looking at the nature of these types was thinking about the intent behind the misinformation. Sometimes it's there to disrupt, sometimes it's there to set an alternate agenda. Recognizing the complexity of the situation, we're fortunate to hear about cases that involved multiple countries dealing with a really unusual crisis situation, and how they all intersect with intent, but also with power and wanting to dominate the space. So these types and those themes have implications for what organizations think about and how they respond. What is also important is, once those types are kind of identified and categorized, is to think about how crisis misinformation was actually detected, and then the process of information vetting that organizations undertake. So a really interesting quote that a quite experienced participant made first up to me was, although it is misinformation to us, they, the public, don't think it is. So it was often the case that participants knew that a particular piece of information was true or not, based on the amount of time that they had invested in the crisis so far, in preparing material for the organisation, and a deep knowledge of the organisation. Naturally, our agency participants had to actually add that layer into the work that they did, whereas it came quite naturally for our in-house participants. So crisis misinformation was often kind of known when it was presented, but it was detected through multiple channels and stakeholders. Often the kind of lean was to media reporting and the aggregation of that by different media houses. But there was often a recognition that some specialized channels existed. And when those specialized channels were, you couldn't actually pop into a Facebook group to be able to see what was being talked about, that the participant either had to lean in on existing relationships that they had with those specialized stakeholders, or seek a place at the table for meetings. But yeah, that's an area, I think, where if those relationships, we often say a crisis is determined by the nature of the relationships you have before the crisis event. I think this is a really true case of really gathering the intel that you need for a crisis misinformation. When it came to vetting, so this is the information processing piece, and it's something that we pay a lot of attention to the cognitive processes that community members go through when they're being confronted with information about a particular natural hazard event that's either emergent or is right at their door. And we will process information either heuristically, so, we'll skim through, find some key points, and then maybe go back through the message again, or very systematically, or we do a bit of both. And so what we wanted to do here was look at the information quality and weighting process that our participants did. And it was really fascinating because you could just, as our participants were talking, I just felt like they were detectives, and looking at this information in a really detailed way, where there was multiple verification stages, even though there was a very strong sense that this was not true. There was still a systematic process to ensure that there was enough data behind that for when a response was determined. So there was a higher sense of trust in self than fact-checking websites. Some questioned the veracity of those, of the evidence behind fact-checking sites. That's a little bit different to some of the practice that happens in the US. And then even when different data were put through, they were put forward, they were also put through a checklist, looking at the source, the content, and also thinking, well, what is this person or what is this organisation trying to do here? So it was a deeper exploration. Detection and vetting can take time, and that is one of the constraining forces that participants identified. But when you have a good organisational culture and you can call on people and people are happy to provide that feedback to you quickly, that is an enabling factor, along with having good tech and good access to data. And I think from a personal point of view, our participants were talking about having comfort with ambiguity and also trusting their intuition, because it may be impossible to get confirmed, verified information. So one of the participants identified that, a 70% comfort level may be all you have, and that might be a better way of weighing up the amount of time it might take to get to 100%. Our next piece was, once we know that crisis misinformation is true, verified or not, was to understand what participants did when they were approaching the decision to combat crisis misinformation or not. And this is where it's really interesting, I think, as an academic and a teacher, when, a lot of our students, when I teach crisis classes, are desperate to get into a crisis role. Some get to work for emergency services organisations soon after they finished university, different kind of environment. But it's difficult to, jump straight from uni into a crisis response position. So opportunities to share practitioner insights and expert views on the decision-making process is really important as an educator. So I'm grateful to the time that our participants give us. The decision criteria in this case related to judgments about the significance and potential consequences of crisis misinformation. So some cases of crisis misinformation were considered lighter than others. If a workplace accident had occurred, for example, and the media reported it as a broken ankle, whereas it was a sprained ankle, the participant was thinking, well, the significance of that, even though it's not true, may not require as strong a response as when there is, a much greater distance between the truth and what the crisis misinformation content was. So they considered that as a process about whether they would respond and how. And they also looked at the power of the source of crisis misinformation. And in some cases, it was a bit of a decision about whether the organisation had any power to influence the stakeholder. So there were some conversations of journos as the source of crisis misinformation versus unions, and a general discussion that if it was the union, there would perhaps be no value in directly going to the union and talking to them about what was true or not, because would it change their mind about the situation? And the reach of crisis misinformation. So, you know, what are we seeing in social media tracking, etc. And is that something that we need to get a handle on, or is it something that, you know, is low significance and may die down, has stopped being shared? So, you know, do we just let it go? Because by combating it, are we actually regenerating discussion about it? And some organisations had a regulatory requirement, or there was expected practice within the organisation that it didn't matter whether the crisis misinformation was significant or not, the organisation always had to address it. So, you know, your organisations may be in that kind of a situation as well. Within this, we looked at ethics and sorry to say PRAA, but no one identified the PRAA Code of Ethics as being critical to this process, but instead we could definitely see there was a strong draw on personal or professional kind of codes of practice that was very much within our participants, but also a reach into the organisational values, and they were real drivers for approaches here, but it wasn't a systematic reflection on ethics. And in some cases, when you're doing interviews, as you know, when you ask a question, you're actually, you get the content on that. It may not be a natural part of decision making. So to the big interesting piece is, with all of that lead up in mind, what do our expert practitioners do in Australia when it comes to crisis misinformation? Well, there's a few different response options, actually. The first one that was really interesting was this notion of a crisis misinformation holding statement. And partially that was motivated because the crisis verification process can take time. And to offset that, the organisation wanted to say, we know that something's happening and we're investigating it, and we will come back to you when we have more information about this. But please go to our site when you need information on ABC. Within this kind of early stage, the advice from participants was to avoid using any absolute or definitive terms, so to talk in broad kind of language. So I thought that was a really clever way of, you know, thinking about how we can use holding statements at different time points in crisis response. When a correction strategy was determined by our participants, there were a few different options there. So some participants would restate the crisis information and then back that up with a statement of fact. Others chose not to restate the crisis misinformation, and that was deliberate because it depends on what you hear and whether you're going to have a primacy bias or a recency bias. If you've got a primacy bias, then you will lock into hearing the organisational spokesperson state the crisis misinformation and not what they really want you to hear, which is what the organisation's truth is on the matter. So it's interesting because in misinformation settings, the restatement of misinformation is shown as being a positive strategy for organisations. But under crisis misinformation, some participants would very strongly say that wouldn't even come on their radar. They would lead with the statement of fact and then reinforce the organisation as the go-to source for content on that particular crisis. So there's some options that, you know, you may want to think about what your go-to responses for crisis misinformation. Others would insert evidence that they'd gathered from their verification processes and involve other sources when it was relevant to do so. If they wanted to introduce an expert into the equation, that could either be from within the organisation or secondary. In my past work with natural hazard communication, you see that we go to those live blogs or 24-hour reporting on hazards. Media are desperate to get alternate sources to speak to, and often emergency services agencies can only give you little glimpses of information because they're in the field. So we've encouraged emergency services agencies to think about who else they could give to the media as appropriate talent, and that's perhaps one way that can also support crisis misinformation media reporting. There's also the potential for correction strategies to adapt by audience. In this study, there was some starting insights about communicating to internal staff when a crisis misinformation case was internally focused. So a recognition that more details could be provided to employees, but also a little bit of concern that how that information would be received should it be released to the media or shared with others. Some organisations, interestingly, chose not to respond, and that was when the misinformation was either dying down or wasn't considered significant, or they would respond by, drawing on the broader crisis narrative and thinking about the importance of the relationships they wanted to have with the stakeholder. I mean, nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. So thinking about the long-term, taking that long-term view was noted by a few participants. And others would actually just wait for consumers or other stakeholders to jump in and kind of regulate the conversations and address the crisis misinformation that way. There was talk of the wisdom of crowds in that sense as well. So these were the different crisis misinformation response strategies. And the main one that we had seen previously in the literature was this second point here around restating crisis misinformation and then backing that up with a statement of fact. So thanks to the insights of our participants, we've been able to share some alternate strategies as part of the research record. As I mentioned, evaluation insight was scant. So we asked our participants this question, and there was a range of different options. Some chose to not have any evaluation piece, and often that could be influenced by the significance of the crisis misinformation. Others were, well, has it died down? Has it gone away? Am I seeing it in my media files or not? If I'm not, it's done. I've dealt with it appropriately, or it's been removed from the conversation. Others went on to examine how the crisis misinformation response changed or diverted the crisis narrative. So within kind of crisis evaluation piece to go, well, is my strategy still working, or do I have to do something different to either get it back on track, or do I just need to change track? So that was a within crisis evaluation piece. The majority of participants would talk about what they could do better next time as part of crisis debriefing. So to pull it all together, it's nothing as good as a good model, right? This is not really a theory, but we can call it a framework. We kind of pulled together what we'd heard from participants at this very abstract level of, when we're looking at crisis misinformation response, we do need to think about the broader crisis at large and the play that's happening there, the outcomes. Is it trust? Is it reputational? Is it viability? Is it safety? What are those, and what are the intersections? But then categorize the type of crisis misinformation, the verification approaches, and then, use the different decision-making criteria to help influence what your strategy choice might be, and then how you'll evaluate it either, within the crisis or at the conclusion of the crisis itself. The next steps for us is that in an exciting way, the FDA had heard about the work that we had been doing, and another colleague in the US had been doing from a more public-oriented way. And we were asked to submit a proposal for work with the FDA around crisis misinformation from a COVID perspective, but also pharmaceutical perspective. So, I hope that comes off. That'll be a bit interesting. But also additional research needs to occur around visual crisis misinformation. And some colleagues at QUT are incidentally doing some work on that, which is really cool. But also the testing of different strategies with publics to see, which ones stick and which ones don't, which will add more robustness to the research record. And I think a deeper dive into internal crisis misinformation would be valuable. So if anyone wants to identify themselves as a potential candidate for that kind of work, we're always interested. And, boldly from a practice point of view, but really interested in hearing your ideas here too, is thinking about the types of relationships that are in existence before a crisis, and how that might help give you insights or support into specialized channels, different decision-making protocols that you might have. And I know for me that there are some things I just do, and it's only when I have a colleague go, well, why do you do that? I'm like, yes, good question. Let me unpack that. So really bringing out our decision-making approaches. And we know from health communication research that it's not just about get vaccinated. What people want to know is why should they get vaccinated? What led to the chief health officer, chief medical officer's decision, and really spelling out their criteria is often what's needed to tip people over to say yes. Ethics and what that might mean for decision making, and then any ideas you might have. So that's really what I'm throwing out to you at this point in time. But I also just wanted to share my contact details and this first link here, which I'll pop in the chat as well. The full journal paper is available for open access until I think it's the 10th of May. So, if you want to have a throwback to your university days, you can read the full journal article. My MBA students always hate it when I set them journal papers to read because they're so long. But hopefully you've just had a good snapshot of our study, and really keen to hear from you now with any questions.
Thanks, Amisha. That was fascinating, and I think some really good insights that are particularly timely given everything that's happening in the world at the moment. Does anyone have any questions for Amisha? If so, you can pop them in the chat. No, nothing has come up. So, Amisha, it looks like you might have addressed everyone's queries, or maybe just overwhelmed everyone with the fascinating research that you've had. And I think certainly from my perspective, we would be great to have some time to digest it. And you were very generous in sharing your email. So certainly, if you're comfortable for people to reach out to you directly on email, that way perhaps any specific questions people may have could be addressed. Absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us online today. I'm sure you'll all agree it's been a really good insight into the work that Amisha and the team at QUT have been doing. And I think certainly I've taken a lot out of what I have heard today, and hopefully you all have as well. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Amisha, for sharing your time and also your research findings, and particularly to Maddie as well, who makes sure that these all happen. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next month.